A fish finder on a kayak greatly enhances your fishing experience. Apart from knowing the depth of the water and the structure of the seabed, they do find fish and are a great asset, particularly when lure fishing. Having the ability to see your lure going down and working amongst the fish is great fun, and in my experience gives you an edge over fishing blind. Even when bait fishing at anchor, you sometimes see shoals of fish moving along the bottom, which is then followed by a bite on the rod tip. With the addition of a GPS, a fish finder can help locate and log new marks you stumble across, marks that may prove productive in the future. I sometimes receive questions about reading a fish finder, and I must admit it took me a while to understand my Garmin Echo 550C before I could use it effectively. Although there are many different fish finders on the market, with the exception of down imaging and side imaging sonars, the basics are the same, so I decided to go through how I use mine to determine the structure of the seabed and recognise fish, and I hope you find it useful. Before we look at identifying structure and fish, let's look at some settings I would recommend. Fish finders have many settings you can learn via the user manual, and if you want to, you can use those settings to customize the finder for the type of fishing you do and the locations you fish. Most of the settings on my finder are set to auto or default. However, the following are a couple of settings I would recommend, one to use and one not to use. Now, one setting that I would recommend not to use is what is known as the fish symbol or fish alarm. If you can just see going past on the screen there, you've got some fish symbols. Now that sounds fantastic, that instead of having to interpret the sonar, the normal sonar readings, to what is fish, to actually use the fish symbol, fish alarm, to tell you that it's fish. Sounds great, but the problem is the fish symbol will show for suspended particles, for suspended matter in the water. Therefore, if it's weed, loose weed will sometimes show as a fish symbol. Now, when I first started using this fish finder, I had the fish symbol on, and sometimes the screen was alive with fish, and I couldn't work out why I wasn't catching anything. Well, it's basically because a lot of it wasn't fish, it was weed. Now, of course, the fish symbol will show when it is fish. But what I find it's much better is to actually interpret the normal sonar readings to determine what is fish and what is not fish. And I can much more accurately determine what's fish by doing that rather than having the fish symbol on. Plus, of course, it can be off-putting. You suddenly see a load of fish symbols all over your screen and you think, oh my God, there's fish everywhere. But I'm afraid the reality is that some of the times that it's not actually fish. So that's a recommendation, is to learn to use your normal sonar readings to determine what is fish and what is weed, rather than the fish symbol. Each to their own personal choice, but that's my recommendation based on my own experience. Here's a really good example of why not to use the fish symbol or fish alarm. Now, if you look on the left hand side of the screen there, you see that line going down. And then on the line, suddenly a lot of fish symbols appear. And it's the same on the right hand side, it's just on the right hand side, the 200 kilohertz side, you can't quite see the line. Now that was my anchor going down. I've just dropped anchor to start a fishing session. And that's my anchor going down. And suddenly all the fish symbols start appearing on the screen, which just goes to show that anything suspended in the water, and that was just my anchor, and the line is showing as a fish. Now, if I didn't have the fish symbol on, of course I clearly know that's my line going down. But there's just an example to show that the fish symbol doesn't necessarily mean that it is fish. Here's another good example of not using the fish symbol. You can see masses of fish symbols on the screen there. If you notice these lines here, all that is, I've been cutting up some squid for bait, and that's just the debris, the waste squid that I've just thrown over the side, and it's slowly sinking to the bottom. But as it sinks to the bottom, it's showing us fish symbols. Now, of course, if that was suspended particles like weed or in the water, and you suddenly saw that on your screen, you'd think, my God, there's loads of fish down there. Well, there's an example that it's not. Now, the last setting that I would thoroughly recommend, and that is to have split frequency. Now, this is a dual beam fish finder, and it has 77 kilohertz and 200 kilohertz. The 200 kilohertz sends down a narrower beam and is said to show more detail of the bottom, and is said to be better in shallow water. And the 77 kilohertz sends down a much wider beam, therefore covers more ground. So it shows more of what's down there around the kayak rather than directly below it. But what I find is really fantastic is to have them both on the screen at the same time, known as split frequency. Then I get the best of both worlds. And what I find is that one side or the other shows more detail. And more often than not, I find that the 77 kilohertz shows more detail in the water column. So it's really a great idea to have both on at the same time. And hopefully I'll be able to show you later from past trips how one side or the other shows more detail. So to have split frequency, again, it's different for different fish finders, but usually it's going to the menu, and on this fish finder into the pages, and then I scroll down and I've got the choice there of split frequency. And then if you notice there that the screen is split straight in half by this line here, and we've got 77 kilohertz on the left and 200 kilohertz on the right. So this one is firing a narrow beam down, I think it's about 20 degrees, and this one's firing a wider beam down. And already there, can you see the difference there, how much more detail in the water column on the 77 kilohertz, and that's the same thing on the 200 kilohertz. And just to explain how it works with split screen, on the 200 kilohertz side, this is the right side of the screen is directly under the kayak, and anything to the left of that has passed under, and the middle line there is directly under the kayak on the 77 kilohertz of the screen, and anything to the left of that has passed under. But both are showing the same thing on the screen. It's just that one side or the other will show more detail, and as we said before, the left side will give a wider view of the bottom. So I would really, if you've got a dual beam fish finder, I would really recommend to have split frequency. It can make the difference between seeing things and not seeing things on the screen. And like I said, this is just personal. I don't really understand the real technical side of fish finders, how exactly they work. I only know the basics of how they work. But I do know that the left side of the screen very often shows fish, sonar return of shoals of fish, better than the other side. Now the secret I find about reading a fish finder and reading sonar returns is all to do with colour. As you can see, this is obviously a coloured fish finder, and what I've got, it works as 4 different colours. You've got red, which is the strongest return. You've got yellow, which is a medium return. You've got light blue, which is a weak return, and then you've got blue there, which is no return. So blue is just water. So if we look down on the bottom there, we've got a fairly clean bottom. We've got very dark red. So anything solid is going to show us as dark red. And when we have a look at a rock later, a rock rising up at the bottom, you'll notice that it's very red. And then if you've got weed, it's usually got yellow in it. There might be a little bit of red, but it's usually yellow coming off, attached to the bottom. And suspended weed particles could just show us little light blue patches in the water column. Now, With colour fish finders, you can have the colour set different in different ways. You could have a white background, but I've chosen to have this as a blue background, with blue as the weakest return. But colours to me are the key, and hopefully I'll be able to show you later how when you get a shoal of fish, how those colours work, how you usually got some red in there, a strong return. And maybe if it's fish such as a shoal of sand eels, you might have a bit of red with the density of the shoal, but a bit more yellow. And then if you get a decent sized fish, you've got a distinct bit of red in it. And like I said, even reading the bottom, you've got the red, you've got the yellow, and you've got the blue. So that to me is the secret of reading a fish finder. It's understanding the colours. And even if you've got I've never had a black and white fish finder, but even if you've got a black and white fish finder, the colour system should still work the same. I mean, you may have black as your hard return, like the bottom would be black, and then you may have a grey, and then a light grey, and then white being your weakest return, white being water. Or it could be a dark shades of grey, very, very dark grey for your bottom, then a lighter shade of grey, then a lighter shade of grey, and then white. I don't know, I never had a black and white fish finder, but basically the 4-colour system is, to me, the way to read the fish finder. The other basics are pretty straightforward. We've got the depth of the water on the right hand side there, and the depth, mine is shown in feet there. This temperature here is not the water temperature. I can't have water temperature. My transducer is not in the water, it's inside the kayak, so basically that's the air temperature around the transducer inside the kayak. Okay, so we got something coming through there. To be honest with you, that's weed. If you notice there, it's got some blue in it, it's got a little bit of yellow. That's probably just weed. But we'll have a look at rock, and we'll have a look at weed attached to the bottom, and hopefully we'll be able to have a look at some shoals of fish in the water column and down swimming close to the bottom. Okay, I've got an example here of rock. I've just gone over a rock and I've just rewound the fish finder and paused it to make it easy for me to show you. And if you notice there, going back to reading colours, obviously there's the shape. We've got the flat bottom there, and then it rises up. But if you also notice the colours, how we got here, we got the dark here, going back to that hard return, showing that it's a very, very hard surface. But more interestingly, if you look just on the top of the rock here, you've got a little bit of red, but you've got some yellow in there and blue. Now what that is actually weed attached to the rock. So again, going back to that hard return, medium return, soft return, we got the hard return of the rock there, the structure, and then on the rock we've got weed growing on the top, where we've got a much lighter return. It's a lighter red, and it's yellow. That's showing weed. So that's a great way of, if you're going over maybe some kelpy ground, you've got some kelp beds, that's what it will show like. And then if there's any rocks amongst it, you'll get the rocks with the kelp and the weed growing to it, obviously attached to it. So there's one example of identifying rock. Apart from the shape, which of course is pretty obvious, it's using the colours, particularly, and in particular when it's weed like that. Even if it's not on rock, it's just weed on the bottom. You can use the colours there to identify that it's weed. And of course, any structure like weed, apart from suspended weed, loose weed in the water column, is going to be attached to the bottom. And of course, that is one way of finding out whether it's structural fish. Is it attached to the bottom? I mean, fish, of course, shoals of fish that are swimming on the bottom. Sometimes that can be a little bit difficult to determine whether it is weed or whether it's fish, particularly if it's quite a dense patch of weed and you've got a lot of yellow in there. But after a while you do learn, you get to learn. Mainly you learn, the best way to learn is by actually catching the fish to determine whether it's fish or weed. So there's a very good example there of rock. The return we are looking at now is fragments of a wreck. This is a diver's photo of the main section of the wreck, and all that is left are still beams covered with weed. The wreck is split into separate sections, and this is one of those sections. The 77 kHz side of the screen, the left side, shows the beam clearly in red, and the yellow around it is weed. If you notice on the 200 kHz side, all you can see is a light blue outline of the beam. This is an example of the advantage of having split frequency. If I just had the 200 kHz on full screen, I would have struggled to see those fragments. What I thought would be a good idea to show you is the screen, the fish finder screen with virtually no return. We've just got a small particles in the water there, which is probably weed, but basically there's nothing there. Got the water column here, we're in about just 93 feet of water. This is the bottom shown on the split frequency, the dark red which shows a hard return. This bottom is mud, but sand would show very similar. Sometimes with sand you get a bit of jagged down the bottom if there's dips and troughs in the sand, but this is just a straight flat muddy bottom. So that's the screen with nothing on, and what we're going to be looking for, we're going to be looking changes in the water column, this area here, and changes to the bottom, where this bottom starts changing. Maybe something just starts rising off the bottom, and maybe it's got a bit of red on it, going back to that colour, being red the strongest return, followed by yellow, followed by blue as a weak return. So usually if I get particles of weed weed floating in the water, loose weed, usually just shows up as very light blue little specks. I mean, sometimes small shoals of squid will also show as a light blue. So there you go, you've got a screen and it's dead. There's absolutely nothing. I'm going to show you the changes later and what will be fish. Okay, I've got some changes in the screen now. You can see that patch coming through there. It's got a bit of tiny little bit of red in it, but it's mainly yellow. Now that probably is fish. That could be small herring, or could even be sand eels. Launch sometimes show us that. There's not a lot of red in there, deep red. So I wouldn't say that was a fairly dense shoal. Usually, if I get a dense shoal of mackerel or a dense shoal of herring, there's more red. But I would say that's just a little shoal of small herring. But you see the change in the screen there. Bottom is still pretty barren, nothing showing down the bottom, but just that patch coming through there. Okay, we've got a change to the bottom there. If you can just see that there, the surface where it was before it was a flat bottom, and we've got something rising up the bottom, and just there you've got a bit of red in it, a bit yellow and red. That's likely to be shoals of fish. Of course, I've no idea what fish they are. They could be just very small fish, but that's fish. Sometimes you get weed coming through, loose weed coming through on the bottom there, but usually if it's weed, it's got no red in it at all. It's just generally a bit of yellow or a bit of blue. A little change in the bottom there, that might be a small shoal of fish. Here we got another example of a change in the bottom there. See that just rising up off the bottom, quite a bit of red in there, red and yellow rising off the bottom. Now remember, this is quite deep, 92 feet of water at the moment. I mean, I could zoom into the bottom, and it's rising just a little bit more off the bottom there. That's going to be fish, shoals of fish. Might be whiting, might be gurnard, might be little codlin. Who knows? You never really know until you actually catch them. But I've got a couple of bait rods out now, as this shoal of fish are passing under. And sometimes, often when you see that, and then you get a bite on the rod tip. Well, I mentioned earlier about those changes in the bottom when you see shoals of fish down the bottom, how it just rises up on the bottom, and you get a bit of red in there. And here's another example there. Just a little change in the flatness of the bottom there. Some patches of red and yellow, and how they're most likely to be fish, and probably shoal fish. Well, there's an example there. There's a whiting there, quite a nice whiting. So that's what you're looking for it's using the colours and the changes in the screen to recognise fish. Fish don't always show us arches. I mean, if I get one come up, if you get maybe a bass swimming underneath, or some individual fish of a reasonable size, they will show us arches. But shoal fish tend to show us patches, either in the water column or on the bottom. And it's using those colours to determine what they are. If you've got a bit of a strong return indicated by the red, a little dense patch, then it's most likely to be fish. Occasionally it's weed, but there's not usually much red in weed. It's usually a much lighter return. So there's just one example of monitoring the bottom. Okay, I'm fishing on a clean bottom at the moment. But it's very similar when you're fishing over rough ground, that you see little patches of red come along that could be cod or pollock. But I'm on clean ground at the moment, and there's an example of what those fish are swimming along the bottom. Got another example coming through there. See the completely featureless bottom there, and then we've got a change in the bottom, just coming up off the bottom. There's a little bit of red in there, so I would say that is fish. Example of a big shoal of something down there. If you notice that there's loads of red in there, and just on the edges there, it turns a little bit yellow and then blue, but it's very dark red. That's the density of a shoal. I mean, it could be whiting, it could be any. Don't really know until you catch them. But I've got the rod tip going there, so I've got whatever it is. I mean, it might be scad, but we'll find out. But there's an indication of a big change in the bottom there, which show, and using the colours to identify that that's fish. Big dense shoal that we looked at earlier turned out to be these big shoal of scad. But what we're looking at there, you can just see that change in the bottom there with some red and yellow in it. That's whiting, shoals of whiting moving along the bottom. So again, it's just seeing the change in the bottom, and the density of the shoal is indicated by the colours. I mean, you don't see fish arches unless you get sort of individual decent sized fish. It's more patches, coloured patches, and the density shows us the colour. And we're talking about the hard return colour on your fish finder, with mine being red. So if it's a really dense shoal, there's a lot more red in it. If it's not so dense, it's the next colour, which is yellow, which is the next return. This is an example of a shoal of fish shown in the water column, taken from a session back in the summer. And this shoal of fish turned out to be mackerel. You can see there's plenty of red in there and a bit of yellow, so it's a fairly dense shoal. Now, fish finders usually pick up individual fish because they've got a swim bladder, and individual fish of a reasonable size tend to show up as an arch. But as we've said earlier, shoals of fish tend to show as patches. And even though mackerel have not got a swim bladder, because they swim in fairly dense shoals, that's why they show up on the finder. We've had a look at identifying shoal fish. That's densely packed shoals of fish, and the density is indicated by the hard return, which is red on my fish finder. And you can tell the density of shoal by how much red is in it. And if it's not so dense, maybe there's just a little bit of red, and then there's a bit more yellow, which is the medium return on my fish finder. But now we're going to have a look at identifying more individual fish. And when I say individual fish, it could be just a fish of a reasonable size swimming on its own in the water column, or a small group of fish. And this is an example of a small group of fish. There's 3 fish here, and because I know this area quite well, I would say these are either sea bass or grey mullet. And this is where you get more of the arch shape that is talked about, that you don't tend to see on densely packed shoals of fish. And looking at the return of this fish on the right hand side here, you've almost got a perfect arch there, with the red in the back of the fish, which is probably the swim bladder, of the fish showing. On the other two fish, you haven't got a perfect arch, you've got parts of the shape of an arch rather than having the perfect arch. You don't always see a perfect arch, sometimes you'll see part of an arch. But the main thing is you've got that deep red there, the hard return. Now if this was just weed, loose weed going by here, there would be no red in it, that would probably just show as blue. It may show as an arch shape which fools you into thinking it's a fish. But usually if you get more individual fish, you'll get an arch shape or a bit of an arch shape, but you'll get that red, or whatever the hard return is on your fish finder, you'll get red, that deep red showing there. So that's just one example of more individual fish showing as that arch shape. The return here is a really good example of both shoal fish and one or two individual fish shown as arches. This is a rough ground mark. You can see the jaggedness of the ground here and the dark red of the hard return. And you've also got some patches here. You've got this patch here, we've got a lot of red in it, and this patch in the water column here, it's got some red and yellow. Now these were densely packed shoals of very, very small pollock. But also showing on this return, you've got one or two arches of fish swimming separate from the shoal. And this is a very good example here. You can clearly see the arch shape and you can clearly see the red at the apex of the arch. And there's just part of an arch here just swimming separate from this shoal. Now that could have been also pollock swimming slightly away from the main shoal, or it could have been other fish, other predatory fish. But that's a really good example of how shoal fish, a densely packed return of shoal fish, tend to show as blotches, whereas more individual fish will show as arches. The other good thing about this return is it clearly shows the difference between the returns of the 77 kHz and the 200 kHz that we talked about earlier. On the left side of the screen, where you've got the 77 kHz, you can see much more detail in the return, whereas on the right side, on the 200 kHz, you can't see so much detail. Now this of course can be due to the fact that the 77 kHz sends down a much wider beam, therefore maybe picking up returns that the much narrower beam on the 200 kHz side is not picking up. But it's a good example of both densely packed shoal fish and one or two fish shown as arches. I mentioned in the introduction that how a fish finder is a great asset when lure fishing. And when I say lure fishing, I mean vertical jigging. The ability to be able to see your lure going down and knowing when to stop the descent to make sure the lure is working amongst the fish is far better than fishing blind. We are looking at some old footage of that working. There are two shoals of fish. This shoal is herring, and this shoal below turned out to be mackerel. I was working both shoals until I got a take. The line you can see here is my lure going down to work amongst the mackerel, then coming up to work amongst the herring, and then back down again to the mackerel. Eventually I got a take from the mackerel. If you notice that the line of the lure going down is not showing on the 200 kHz side of the screen. This is probably because the line went down at a slight angle and outside the narrower beam of the 200 kHz, but within the beam of the wider 77 kHz. This is another example of the benefits of using split frequency. To see your lures going down and working amongst the fish, it is important to maintain as vertical jig as possible to make sure the lure does not drift out of the sonar beam. There are several ways to achieve this. One is using the wider beam as already discussed. The other is to use braided line, which is much thinner than nylon and therefore less drag on the line. And the third is to use a drift chute when drift fishing to slow down the drift and maintain a vertical jig more easily rather than increasing the weight of the lure. It takes a lot of practice to learn how to use your fish finder and recognise structure and fish. The best way to learn what is fish is by catching what you see on the screen. But once you have mastered how to read your finder, it is definitely a great asset. Now I've learned to use my finder effectively, I would hate to be without it. Although many of you will be fishing in very different locations than I fish, and targeting many different species of fish, I hope that for those of you that are new to fish finders, this has been some help. Once again, many thanks for watching.